Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Dr. Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. His latest book, Feeling Great, contains powerful new techniques that make rapid recovery possible for many people struggling with depression and anxiety. Dr. Burns is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Hello, Rhonda.
Hello,
and
David.
Hello, Matt.
And hello, Matt.
Hello. Good to be here with you.
Good to be here with you, Matt. It's just great to be with you, I should say.
Yeah. And welcome to all of our listeners to episode 294, to welcoming our listeners around the country and across the world. And so because Matt's here, it's across the galaxy too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
I was telling Matt and David that the last Ask David episode we did when Matt was here, we got a lot of really positive endorsements. So I thought I would read a couple, and that will lead to our topic for today, which is acceptance. So Jeff wrote us about that episode, which was 287. Hi, Dr. Burns. I very much enjoyed this episode. You had mentioned doing a future podcast on the concept of acceptance, and that sounds like a wonderful topic for a podcast. If you do an acceptance episode, I'd be interested in your views on how the desire to improve oneself works with acceptance. Meaning, if I accept myself, warts and all, is there still motivation to improve oneself? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, as well as Matt's and Rhonda's and anyone else's. Thank you, Dr. Burns. I get so much out of your podcast. Jeff.
That's great. We'll start with the podcast with that one, actually. We'll answer that question.
Okay. Well, I'm going to just read one more because it's only 2 sentences. And this is from Sarah, our beloved Sarah Shane from the Tuesday group. And she wrote, I loved your latest podcast with Matt May, episode 287, which we posted for you to know on April 11th of 2022. It was excellent. I especially loved the beautiful discussion on acceptance.
Well, thank you, Sarah. She's one of my favorite people in the whole world. And, what a brilliant and kindly and loving human being she is. There was a third one. Maybe you already read it the previous week, but it was that fellow who listened to the episode and he really got it. And he sent us this great.
Okay.
You have that
here
one?
It is. Yes. This is from Jeff. And he wrote, I finally get what you're saying. I've pondered the death of the self for quite a while after reading Feeling Great, and it finally sunk in. Saying, I want to improve myself, or I want to become a better person, is nonsensical. It's like there's an amorphous ghost self that I want to somehow improve or make more worthwhile, but it's all made up. There is no actual self, meaning I can improve skills I have, but myself won't be better. My skills might be better, but there's no self to improve. For example, I can improve my juggling skills, but never myself. Wow. Even when it comes to flaws, I can see that they're very specific. I don't have a flawed self or a bad self. I may have certain specific flaws, but there's no I or self to be flawed or worthless. It did take me a long time to see it, but now that I do, how awesome it is to stop having to improve myself. Instead, I can just let go of myself. Thank you for the response and the additional information. It's so helpful. And that is from Jeff.
And that's just fantastic. And that is the statement of someone at the moment of experiencing enlightenment. And it is so simple and basic that when you get it, you're really getting nothing because there was nothing there in the first place. But you see that for the first time. And it is freeing because once you see that the idea of a self is just nonsensical, it frees you up from a lot of baggage you've been carrying and battles that you've been fighting your entire life, trying to improve yourself or become good enough and that type of thing. And yet it's so basic that a lot of people just can't get it. And that's why we're having this podcast. Maybe we can shed a tiny bit of additional light on it for a few additional folks.
Well, I love in the memo that you have written that, I don't know how many people you shared it with, but that you shared with Matt and me, where you defined enlightenment as an experience of great joy when you suddenly feel close to other people and you have no territory to defend, no fears, no criticism, no fears of criticism, no fears of failing or falling short. And you just see with crystal clarity that the distorted negative thoughts that previously triggered so much pain are just simply not true.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a great experience. And if people want, it's a very humble memo. I was trying to create a class for the app that I'm developing with Jeremy and several other people. And by the way, Jeremy sings your praises, Matt, about every 4 minutes. Oh. And I think very
kind of him.
Very deservedly so. But now I don't even remember what I was saying, but I accept that. But what was I saying?
You were talking about this humble memo that you wrote.
Oh, yeah, I'll attach it. It's 25 paths to acceptance. There's only 22 in there, but I'm accepting the fact that it isn't a precise memo and it's not the greatest thing in the world. But I was just trying to make notes for myself on what would I put into a class in the app, a class on the acceptance paradox. What are the best examples or the best tools for people? But I'll turn it into a PDF and have a link to it in the show notes in case anyone wants to read it. But keep your expectations low because it's not a polished thing. Although there's a polished story at the end with some quizzes and things that you might want to take and have some fun with. But Matt has promised to get us started on this topic, and he has some very profound things to say about enlightenment and the acceptance paradox and the concept that the self is a nonsensical thing and the death of the self and how to achieve it and how to enjoy it as an actual rebirth.
I love that, David. I will see what I can do with that. So, I mean, maybe we could define a few terms as we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Define away.
We could talk about self-acceptance. What we're talking about there. What does that mean? And I thought the passage Rhonda read of your description of self-acceptance was beautiful and inspiring. And I think another way that you've said that is that self-acceptance is just sort of liking ourselves as is, no contingencies, just warts and all, flaws and all, just liking who we are. And one thing you mentioned I think I'm as much of a dog person as you are a cat person, David. I just love dogs. And one thing you said during training together, when you were training me, was that we don't expect a lot of our pets. We don't expect our dogs, for example, to have any kind of advanced degrees or abilities or skill sets, or to bring home more money or be any different than they are. We just love them exactly the way they are. And that was helpful for me just to get that sense of, oh yeah, it's a choice to love a dog, flaws and all. And we can do that for ourselves. We can offer ourselves that same kindness and forgiveness and acceptance and even expect that we wouldn't be perfect.
I'm glad you remember that dog story from our training. And now you'll know why it wasn't very effective when I kept asking you to sit up and then offering you a dog treat.
I was a very bad dog.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Matt, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I had that conversation with a client just this week, and he said, I don't want to accept myself, warts and all. I don't like my warts.
Right. And I think that's one of the more common reasons. So the pieces of outcome resistance or why we wouldn't want to apply the acceptance paradox, as powerful as it is. And I think, David, you and I have both just had this experience over and over again of that being the method where when we're employing it, and it's often an externalization of voices, that's when people recover. And it's like they stop demanding that they be any different than they are and criticizing themselves and beating up on themselves. And they're finally free. They're liberated from that, from depression. Yeah.
That's what I mean by the acceptance paradox. Accepting yourself exactly as you are is the biggest change a human being can make. Acceptance, radical acceptance and radical change is exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
They sound opposite. You've got a story. I've got a story. Matt has many stories.
Can I ask you one more question? So you said that this concept of acceptance is really difficult for people to grasp and to take on, because we kind of cling to the concept that we're flawed, and it's almost
and
like
also that we have a self,
and we're going to lose
soul.
Yeah, and then we're going to lose something if we accept. Well, what are we going to lose if we accept ourselves? Why is it so hard?
Yeah. Well, you ask people, what are they afraid of? And they say, I won't have a self.
Yeah.
I don't want to lose myself because I won't have an identity after that. Well, I don't have a self. I don't have an identity. And my cat doesn't mind. Rhonda doesn't mind. But can we focus on this? The whole thing about the self, it's just a big con, really. You're afraid of losing something that's just a made-up concept. But let's just start with the desire to improve. How does that work with self-acceptance? And I can give an example of that right now. You told me, Rhonda, that I was crabby in the group last Tuesday. And I was very annoyed because I get irritable sometimes, a lot of times, really. And someone in the group asked a question about a patient. And I said, what did the patient say? And what did you say next? And then I'll give you the solution. We'll see the whole thing. And she kept rambling. And I said, come on now, you're not answering my question.
No, you said, come on now.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Come on now, damn it. Listen to me. I'm the guru. Shut up.
That's what you said.
I didn't say that, but I was kind of crabby, and she kept rambling on. And I said, what did the patient say? And what did you say next? And I felt annoyed because she kept wanting to kind of talk about all the errors the patient was making. And how difficult the patient was. And I wanted to focus on the error that she was making. She finally came around, and here's what the patient said, and here's what I said next. And then we solved the problem. But the whole idea here of acceptance is, Rhonda, you were saying in your kind and loving way, weren't you, David, being a bit kind of irritating and annoying and bad teaching? And then we laughed about it. And the answer is yes. I was a pain in the ass in the group. But if you accept yourself, I can accept that. I can focus on that, and then I can do something about it. I can apologize this week. I can try to change my teaching style. But if you don't accept, if you're not accepting yourself, if you're condemning yourself, then you get ashamed. You can't stand to hear about it. It's got to be kept secret. You keep doing the same thing. The acceptance leads to it enhances your capacity to improve and to change. I had a patient I treated who was a radiologist. Let's just say he was, to disguise things, he was working in Sacramento, let's say, in a private community hospital. He was making a ton of money, but he kept making mistakes reading x-rays. And then they would have conferences, medical conferences, and his colleagues would point out, can't you see that patient has something real obvious, like pneumonia? Do you see how congested those lungs are? Why didn't you diagnose pneumonia? And then he would get humiliated, embarrassed, and he would say to himself, I shouldn't have screwed up. Even a medical student could have made that diagnosis. Mm-hmm. Now, one of his negative thoughts was, I shouldn't have screwed up. And that's a should statement. And can you see that he's not accepting his errors? Mm-hmm. He's trying to punish himself for his errors. And I told him, no, your thought is incorrect. The correct thought is, I should have screwed up. Can you folks see why he should be screwing up constantly?
I can.
Can you too, Rhonda?
Okay, sorry, no. Because he's a doctor, and if he screws up, he could hurt someone.
Well, yes, he's on his way to killing a patient. And why should he be doing all of these errors? Why should he be screwing up, Rhonda?
So that he can learn and improve?
No. He should be screwing up because he's a shitty radiologist.
Oh. He didn't know that information. He didn't have that experience already that taught him this lesson.
Yeah, and the standards for a radiologist are far above where he's at.
Yeah.
So I said, you've got a choice. You can either accept the fact in a loving way that you are a shitty radiologist and you are about to start killing people and keep making a lot of money, or you can just accept that fact and resign and sell your fancy house in the fanciest neighborhood and go back and get a year or 2 or 3 of additional radiology training and develop a great skill set. And by gosh, I have to hand it to that guy. He resigned at the hospital, and he went back and did 2 additional years of radiology.
Wow.
But you see, he couldn't do that until he accepted the truth, the fact that but if you keep condemning yourself and say, I should be better than I am, you're just gonna get stuck.
Could I follow up on that a little bit?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think oftentimes the perception is when people are feeling like worthless and defective and they're criticizing themselves, that's going to be their superpower that will lead to improvement.
Yeah, right.
That would be the mechanism.
Yeah.
But that's really not the mechanism by which people improve. That improvement is the result of practice and failure and feedback and taking that feedback into consideration and trying again and failing again. And that process becomes possible, and we'll avoid that process if we're afraid of failure.
Yeah.
If we're thinking, I shouldn't fail, that's wrong and bad, I should be perfect, then we're not open to this sort of experimental learning and growth that leads to rapid improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's why I've developed all these scales for therapists that patients fill out and rate you at the end of each session. And it's so easy to fail on these scales because they're so sensitive, and anything other than a perfect grade is a failing grade. And the reason I want therapists to be able to fail is because all the great things in therapy almost come from therapeutic failure. And there's 4 different ways that therapists can fail in team therapy. And if you approach your failures with humility, it always leads to a deepening of the therapeutic relationship and generally a major breakthrough for the patient. But you have to be willing to set your practice up such as that you're always fine-tuning your skills and always measuring your effectiveness in every session and using all of your failures and shortcomings as ways of learning and growing, exactly as you said, Matt.
Well, it's kind of, you guys are describing what Angela Duckworth describes as grit, where you come up with, you face a challenge and you can fail from it, but it's exactly what you described, Matt. You continue practicing and getting feedback and trying again, and you don't let the failure prevent you from trying again.
Yeah, and you're focusing on your skills, not yourself. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to improve my teaching skills. If I can improve my teaching skills, I don't feel like I have a better self. Better than what? Better than who? Mm-hmm. But it's more fun to teach when you have better teaching skills and do a better job for your students. You told me a neat story before we started. Do you remember that one, Rhonda, about one of your patients that you saw today?
Yeah, I just started seeing this guy, and I only saw him once, and immediately I liked him, and he's a really great guy.
But he spent the whole session labeling himself and saying he's depressed because he's a loser and he's not manly enough and he's too quiet and he's too this and this is wrong about him and this is wrong about him. And I thought, oh my, I'm so happy that we're doing this podcast on acceptance, because it felt like he has zero acceptance of himself. And because of that, he was just in the throes of this deep depression.
Yeah. Yeah, that all depression comes from overgeneralization or labeling. It's impossible to feel depressed without those two errors. And what that means is, like, you break up with someone, then you say, I'm unlovable. That's the idea that you have a self that's no good.
I'm hard to live with.
Yeah, it's not your interpersonal skills need to tune up, or maybe you need to learn the dating game a little bit better. But when you think I have a self that's not good enough, that's where the pain comes. And then I was telling you, your story reminded me of this. Let's see, let's disguise it a little bit. Let's call this guy a CIA agent that I treated, and he'd been depressed his whole career. And he told me that the reason for his depression was because he didn't have a sense of humor. And at work, he said on the breaks, all the guys go and they gather around the coffee machine or the water machine or whatever it is, and they tell jokes. And that's the thing to do. And he pretends to laugh, but he says, I just don't have a sense of humor, and none of them strike me as funny. And I don't have any jokes to tell. And I just feel like I'm less of a man. I'm not one of the guys. I'm not good enough. And so my goal with him and was to get him to accept the fact that he didn't have a sense of humor. See, the problem wasn't his lack of sense of humor, but the fact that he's beating up on himself all the time. That's pretty obvious, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we tried 6 or 8 or 10 different things that didn't work. And finally, we tried kind of a feared fantasy or externalization of voices. And I had him play his negative self or some imaginary critic who was ripping him to shreds. And I was going to play his self-loving self, the accepting, self-loving self. And he said, well, you're not much of a man because you don't have a sense of humor. And every other guy in the CIA where you work, they all have sense of humor. They're telling funny stories all the time, and you can't do that. And I said, oh, yeah, that's absolutely true. That's just one of my many flaws. I've got others that are a lot worse. But yes, I absolutely have no sense of humor at all. And when I said that, it struck his funny bone, and he started laughing, and he practically fell out of his chair because the moment he accepted himself, the fact that he had no sense of humor, suddenly he had the greatest sense of humor around. And it was such a gratifying moment. But that's, again, the paradox. When you accept your shortcomings, instead of beating up on yourself, your whole view of the world changes. Now, I don't know if this is all we need for our listeners or if this is helping anybody, but you're right, Matt, that there's a war of the worlds inside, because there's a part of us that says, I am not going to accept that. And I remember early in my career, I would never accept the fact that there was a patient I couldn't help because I had ego. I thought I had a self, and that if I could cure anybody, I would have some kind of superior self. And all it led to was arguments, because when I had a patient with severe borderline personality disorder and they'd say, oh, Dr. Burns, you're not helping me, or you can't help me, it wounded my sense of pride. And I would get into an argument with them. What do you mean I can't help you? And the tensions would escalate. But I didn't want to admit that I hadn't been helpful. And then finally the day came, and I remember saying to a patient, and I probably said this a million times, but said, Dr. Burns, you're not helping me. And I said, I agree with you. And I feel so sad because, I really like you. And I just feel that there's a tremendous potential for us to work together and change your life. But I have to admit that I have not been helpful to you. And I haven't really done a good job of understanding you or supporting you. And I can imagine you feel so disillusioned, so angry, and so hurt, and so alone. Can you tell me more about that? I really want to hear how you feel and what it's been like for you. And then it's like the heavens opened up and she started crying and opened up, and then we just started working together so beautifully. And I saw the joy of failure, being able to fail, not having to be successful all the time, not having to impress people. That's how I have experienced it. Everyone experiences this differently. This is enlightenment is a different experience for everyone. For me, the technique that's been the most helpful is be specific. I used to have that, what if I really am worthless? And that bothered me a lot. And so if I would see a criticism about me that was valid, I would say, maybe I'm worthless. And one day it dawned on me, well, if let's say you criticize my teaching, well, that was a very valid criticism of my teaching last week. And there was some good stuff in my teaching last week, too. Mm-hmm. People have such low standards, most of them seem to like the evening in spite of my bad behavior at times. But it just one day it dawned on me that if someone criticizes me, they're not criticizing me, they're criticizing something that I did. And that criticism is probably valid. And it's something I can learn from and improve my skills. But myself isn't involved in that equation. And it was just like getting out of prison. But we're afraid to let go of the self. We're afraid to let the self die because we think we're going to lose some really important thing that we had. I have a self. This is so wonderful. Yeah, the glass doesn't have a self. I have a self. I'm better than that glass. Or something like that, David will now shut up and let the wiser people speak.
I love everything you're saying, David. I would encourage you to keep going. And I think one thing that may be worth talking even more about is, okay, so we've got this amazing tool, self-acceptance, and yet many people who desperately need it and could benefit from it wouldn't want to do it. They wouldn't want to accept themselves the way that they are. They want to be a different self. In fact, it could feel like, I think there are several different reasons people wouldn't want to employ self-acceptance.
Right. Uh-huh. And many reasons.
There are many reasons. And we could talk about those a little bit because those are not always obvious. People are often not aware of where they're stuck. And then, like you've said, when we bring this resistance to the surface, oftentimes that's very helpful for people to see it. And that one would be that desire to improve, and that's a big one. But there are others we could talk about too.
Yeah, and this can be a method too. If anyone's interested, we could do a paradoxical cost-benefit analysis and list all the good reasons not to accept yourself, all the good reasons to keep beating up on yourself.
Do you want to do that?
I would be interested in doing that. I think that's worth just talking about. What are these barriers to this profound recovery that we're talking about, this enlightenment and alleviation of symptoms of depression? You could have that, but here might be some reasons you wouldn't want it.
Well, if I accept myself, and you can write these down on a piece of paper if you want to do it at home, but if I accept myself, I'll just be ordinary, or even below average, and I won't be special.
Yeah, that's a big one. Maybe it's even a slippery slope. If I give myself an inch of acceptance and like myself at all right now, then I'll just be off track. I'll give myself a mile. I'll never improve.
Yeah.
It kind of hurts to accept myself.
Mm-hmm. And why does it hurt?
It hurts
supposed to be better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it hurts. It hurts to accept myself. I'll just be settling for second rate. I'll be giving up and settling. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It would be kind of shameful. Like if I'm here celebrating and happy and joyful, it's like, and everyone else is seeing that I'm flawed, they would judge me. It's better for me to be the first one to notice how flawed I am.
If people see I'm flawed, they'll judge me. Yeah. Any other reasons not to accept ourselves? I'll lose my motivation to grow and change.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
I mean, it's something I'm familiar with, so it would be kind of uncomfortable to not accept myself. It'll force me out of my comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
How about it would be immoral and wrong to accept
Yeah.
someone like myself who's done things that have been hurtful to other people?
Yeah. So I deserve to suffer.
Absolutely. I'm doing the right thing to feel guilty or bad.
And what was yours, Rhonda? I was about to write it down, and I wrote this immoral and wrong one down. What
that was brilliant, Matt.
Comfort zone.
I'm comfortable already, not accepting myself, so it would be uncomfortable to push myself.
Yeah.
Out of that comfort zone space.
Should this be done with people on an abstract level, like what we're doing now, or just a specific moment? Is acceptance something you learn on an abstract level, or at one moment when you were upset?
Specific moment.
So specific moment. Yeah, I think so too. But given all of these reasons not to accept oneself, then you know, maybe you don't want to change. Maybe you don't want to go in this direction. I did something bad. I had an abortion when I was a young woman, and so I think I should beat up on myself indefinitely, right?
Well, maybe, yeah, or maybe I would have to be I'm lowering my standards so much to accept myself.
Yes, I don't want to.
I don't want to lower my standards.
Yeah. To lower
my standards are almost like second place, right? At least I've got those. If I don't have what I would really wish for, at least I have high standards, and I'm doing the right thing to be critical of myself. I'm just being brutally honest.
Right.
Yeah.
With myself.
Yeah, that's another thing. My self-criticism shows that I'm honest about my flaws.
Yeah, and have integrity.
Yeah.
And humility.
Yeah,
I'm not a narcissist. I don't, claim to be perfect when I'm not.
Right.
Which is really a plus.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I'm just jumping around in my brain, but I'm thinking we could do
Well, maybe you could ask that question again, because we came up with more lists on the reasons not to give up.
Well, we've got 11 reasons not to accept yourself. So then how do we bring this to closure?
Well, with all those really great reasons, why would you want to accept yourself?
And then if the person says, I don't want to, then you would say,
okay, is there something else you'd like to work on?
Yeah. Or are you beating up on yourself enough? Could I help you perhaps beat up on yourself some more?
Mm-hmm.
That was my attempt at humor.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Well, Pete, I mean, I think you would probably get the reaction that we both gave you. Like, what are you talking about? I don't want to beat up on myself. It's painful. It's depressed, and I feel depressed. I'm in pain.
Yeah. Absolutely. So how are you going to reconcile this, that there's all these reasons to beat up on yourself and yet you're in pain? So what are you going to do, Rhonda?
Well, that's why I came to therapy, Dr. Burns. That was my attempt at humor.
I was going to try to say something equally ludicrous.
That wasn't funny either.
Let's do kind of a feared fantasy. That kind of an I judge you feared fantasy.
Okay.
And you guys want to be the attackers or the defenders?
Matt, what do you want to be?
I am open to either.
Well, we can do role reversals to get the ball rolling.
Yeah.
I'll be the worst critic. What would the worst critic say to you, Matt?
I don't know. You can be creative there. Okay.
Well, Matt, I understand that you're trying to accept yourself. Is that true?
Yeah. I'm trying to accept myself. That's true.
Mm-hmm. Well, I heard through the grapevine to accept yourself, you had to lower your standards and accept your many mediocre aspects of your life and personality.
I did have to do that. That's true.
Well, I judge you.
Well, I admire you. You. It sounds like you have tremendously high standards for yourself, and I've just been noticing you're quite a human being, quite a specimen of awesomeness over there. Is that your secret to have high standards for yourself?
Yes, I have some of the highest standards you'll ever want to come across.
Oh, that's wonderful. How did you achieve that?
It just through my superiority. It's because of my fantastic self. You see, I don't have to accept my flawed self.
Wow, that's amazing. I have so many flaws. I've just kind of lost track of them and have decided it's better just to accept those with a light heart and, feel like I've got lots of amazing friends with flaws as well that I love to hang out with and spend time with. But you probably wouldn't want to join us, would you?
Okay, well, I'd say you kind of won. It's probably a little drab, what we just did, probably a little lacking in dynamism, kind of a made-up thing I popped into my brain.
I can accept that.
Yeah, right, sure. What else can we do to bring this topic to life?
Well, maybe if Matt wasn't so enlightened.
That's my problem.
I mean, Matt, you're already at a really enlightened stage.
Yeah.
One thing I was wondering about is it possible that people are resistant to this self-acceptance idea or tool method for very good reasons, that they are misunderstanding what we're trying to offer them, that we're saying, okay, you could accept, yourself, flaws and all, but what they're hearing is something different. They're saying, oh, you want me to give up.
Yeah.
You want, and I would say that would be an unhealthy version of self-acceptance. Like, I'm just screwed up and there's no point trying anything. And we could instead, like, how would we revise that to a healthy version of self-acceptance where I will be totally unaccountable. Like the fear is that, I would be doing the wrong thing to like myself.
Sure. I used to use a list of 10 characteristics of healthy versus unhealthy acceptance, and maybe we could highlight a few of those. Whether it'll be helpful to people, I don't know. But one thing about unhealthy acceptance is it's associated with depression and kind of self-hatred. And then healthy acceptance would be associated with feelings of joy and self-esteem. And in fact, when you develop an unconditional self-esteem and you're feeling joy, you can actually throw that away too, because you realize I don't need a self. I don't need self-esteem. I'm too busy having fun. I'm too busy being alive. Another characteristic of unhealthy acceptance, which you see in patients with severe depression, is is kind of cynicism and hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And in healthy acceptance, instead of cynicism, you have laughter. And laughter is one of the paths to enlightenment. But I can remember patients I've treated with severe depression and borderline personality disorder sometimes as well, who are just extremely cynical and sour always in their view of themselves and other people as well. And then another contrast would be paralysis versus productivity. The unhealthy acceptance, you see what you think you're accepting is the fact that you're a loser. You still think you have a self. But you think you have a bad self, a flawed self, a defective self, and so you can't take chances. Like we're doing this podcast on very little preparation. It could be a total blooper or a partial blooper or whatever, but we can be playful and have fun and take a chance. And if it helps some people, great. And if it's a waste of time, oh well, worse things happen. Like constipation is worse than a bad podcast, for example. And that was, really a beautiful, humorous comment, David. We have to edit in the laugh track for that one.
But David, when you're talking about healthy versus unhealthy acceptance, if somebody's really disliking themselves and labeling themselves, how do they move toward self-esteem out of self-hatred? And how do they?
You mean in a team therapy session, or using the Feeling Good app, or what?
Yeah, in a team therapy session.
Well, first it goes TEAM, going to measure how depressed they are and how suicidal they are, how angry, how anxious at the start and end of the session. Then we're going to empathize and not try to help them, but just to try to see the world through their eyes and provide warmth and support. And then we're going to ask them if there's something that they want help with, and make that very specific. And if we had a miracle and at the end of the session, a miracle would happen, what miracle would you be hoping for? And maybe they're saying, I'd like not to be depressed and having all these negative thoughts all the time. And then we can do positive reframing and show them what their negative thoughts and feelings show about them that's positive and awesome. And see if they still want to press that magic button and have all these negative thoughts and feelings disappear. And sometimes, because then all these positives about you were going to go down the drain, the idea is to honor and celebrate your non-acceptance and your self-criticisms and your depression and your guilt and your shame, rather than struggling to overcome them. And it's kind of like one of those Chinese finger traps. The more you try to fight against your negativity, the more intense it becomes. We were writing about that today. We were editing your Jake story, and how this fellow accepted, the moment he accepted with your help, Matt, that he was anxious, suddenly his anxiety finally disappeared. And so I call that positive reframing kind of part of the team model, emotional acceptance. You learn to accept your negative emotions, your guilt, your shame, your depression, your rage, your hopelessness, your loneliness, your inadequacy, your worthlessness, instead of fighting to change them. And the paradox is the moment you accept them and see that they're really an expression of your core values as a human being, and that there's really something beautiful and positive and helpful about them. The moment you accept them, then poof, they diminish and frequently disappear. In fact, we started a new beta test of the Feeling Good app today, and just before the podcast, I got an emergency call from Jeremy and the woman who's administering it, because it's supposed to be a 3-week beta test, and they had a whole bunch of people dropped out prematurely, and this hasn't happened in our previous beta tests. And so we looked them up, and they all dropped out at the end of positive reframing because all of their negative feelings had dropped to zero.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That is wonderful. Yeah. So what looked like a failure was actually a huge success.
Yeah, but we've got to educate them. Don't stop when it goes to zero, because we got to do relapse prevention training, and there's still more good stuff to teach you. But it was so interesting when some people kind of get it. The impact is pretty phenomenal. But I don't know, are we getting anywhere, Matt or Rhonda? Are we helping people or making any of this clear?
I don't know. I'm having a good time though. I might add on one other thing to the list of unhealthy self-acceptance is when it's sort of in the angry blaming variety. It's like I'm actually superior and better. It's everything is their fault. Other people are to blame. This kind of narcissistic fantasy that would also be an unhealthy version of self-acceptance.
That's right. In fact, there are 4 deaths of the self, maybe the 4 forms of acceptance that we promote in team therapy, 4 for the therapist and 4 for the patient, but for 4 for the patients. The first is the death of the special self, and that's involved in recovery from depression, where you give up the idea that you are or are going to become special. And letting go of that is the path to enlightenment, insofar as we're thinking of recovery from depression and inadequacy. And then in recovery from anxiety is the death of the fearful self, where you use exposure and confront your worst fear and surrender to your worst fear instead of running or trying to control your anxiety. And then you discover that the monster has no teeth. And that's a second form of enlightenment, a second death of the self. And the one you just mentioned, Matt, which to me is usually the most painful of all, the interpersonal death of the self, where you discover that you've been blaming your spouse or your students in the Tuesday group or whatever, for some conflict in the relationship. And then you discover that you're actually the very cause of what you've been blaming other people for. And that can be very painful and humiliating. And yet that opens the door to working to change yourself rather than blaming others, and opens the door often to intimacy and greater satisfaction in your relationships. And then in addictions, there's the death of the entitled, craving, pleasure-seeking self, where you think, oh, I've got to have my booze or my food or my whatever, and then the enlightenment there is realizing that you didn't need that thing for pleasure and joy and satisfaction in your life. That's just a simple structure of 4 forms of acceptance, 4 deaths of the self that lead to 4 different kinds of emotional transformation.
It's difficult to give up the idea that you're special, because everybody wants to be special.
Yeah.
But one thing you've said before is that when you give up the idea of being special or impressive, then you become impressive and the world becomes special.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what I've learned from my cat Obi and from our current cat Sweetie Pie, is when you no longer have to be special, the world becomes special. Last night, for the first time, we adopted her about 1.5 years ago, and she glommed onto my wife. And I was always kind of grade B, but I was a good fallback position. But last night we were on the couch watching some of the basketball playoffs, and she jumped off of her perch and got on the couch. And Melanie was on one end of it, and I was on the other, and we both had our legs spread out. And she was looking, whose lap am I going to get on? And for the first time, I looked at her, and she kind of smiled and walked over and got onto my lap. And then she rolled over on her back, which she's never done on Melanie's lap, to show me her tummy. And then I started petting her tummy for about 20 or 30 minutes, just nonstop. And she was just purring like an outboard motor on a boat or something like that. She was so happy, and it was, but it was very special. But I wasn't being special. She wasn't being special. I was just an average person with an average cat on my lap. But it was a really beautiful experience.
Nice.
And like, what did you think of me when I agreed with you about how offensive and goofy my teaching was last Tuesday?
Actually made me kind of fall in love with you even more.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was so easy. It's just so easy to talk to you. And that's something else I wanted to say. When you said in that role play that you said earlier, and when a client says to you, "You're not helping me," and you say, "Oh yeah, you're right," and you must be feeling so disillusioned and hurt and alone. I was just imagining being your patient and hearing you say that and feeling like, oh, you just so understand me.
Yeah.
I mean, even that response feels like an enlightened moment.
Yeah, those are the chance for enlightenment is around us all the time, and it's sad. I think it's Buddha was saying this, nothing different, I don't think, than from what we're trying to say on this podcast. But I think he too was frustrated because almost none of his followers. He had over 100,000 followers, I've heard, when he was alive, and only 3 of them apparently achieved enlightenment. And I'm sure it was frustrating to him because what he was trying to teach people is just so simple and basic. And it's something a 4th grader could understand, but adults can't get it. And Wittgenstein had the same problem because when he was alive, it was rumored that only 7 people in the world could understand what he was trying to say. And he was saying something almost identical, but in the realm of philosophy rather than in the realm of emotions. But the idea is that there's no such thing as a worthless human being. There's no such thing as a worthwhile human being. But our specific behaviors can be more or less worthwhile, and half of the time we're actually below average in everything that we do. And but we don't want to accept that because we think that somehow we are special or we're going to become special, and that when we become special, something great is going to happen. Like if you achieved specialness and they gave you a certificate that confirmed that you had achieved specialness, what would you do with the certificate? Like if you were at a cocktail party, you could like show it to people and they'd admire you, or
I love that. That's great, David.
I love it too.
Well, thank you.
Well, what if someone is failing to accept themselves? They're upset at themselves because they're failing at that.
Wow.
Well, there's a really fantastic answer to this, and it's going to bring a smile to everyone's face, and it's going to instill profound wisdom in all of our listeners. And Rhonda and Matt will now reveal the answer to that question.
Well, if someone was failing to accept themselves and we're going through the team model, we would fall back and give them more empathy, and maybe you would explore their resistance some more and start all over with the outcome resistance. But first, give them a lot of empathy.
Yeah. And make it specific. What time of day were you wanting to accept yourself? Is it this moment? Was it 1:30 this afternoon? What was going on? Once you put the specific details, things get out of the philosophical realm and into the practical realm pretty quickly.
Do you have another answer for that, Matt?
My current one, I don't know how it'll sound, is that we could accept that about ourselves too.
Of course, yeah. We drift in and out of enlightenment. That's what the Buddha said, although Buddhist and some, I guess, mysticism experts pound me when I say that. They claim it's not true. But I think it's a very helpful idea that we drift in and out of enlightenment. Once you get into enlightenment, everything feels so wonderful, seems so easy. But then 2 or 3 days later, you're feeling irritable again. You're beating up on yourself. You're annoyed with other people. You've drifted out of enlightenment. And no one can escape from this. That paper, did we talk about that paper on the impossibility of achieving consistently good mental health?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, it's an Albert Ellis paper, and I mentioned it now in the Tuesday group. And then someone, maybe I'll put the link to it. But I loved Ellis. He was really the grandfather of cognitive therapy, and a lot of what Beck did, he really learned from Albert Ellis. And it's an internet paper. You can just Google it and find it. But he was just making the point. And I think Jacob Towery really loved it. The people in the Tuesday group really loved it. It's not possible to be happy all the time. It's not possible to be in, optimal mental health all the time. It's not possible to be enlightened all the time. And just as you said, Matt, that's something to accept. Yeah.
I did a poor job of timing my fluid intake, so I'm just going to take a quick break to run to the restroom.
Well,
what are you going to do in the restroom?
All kinds of different things. I haven't made up my mind yet.
But the podcast has been close to an hour, so why don't we, just wrap up and say bye, and then you can have your privacy, Matt.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Are we finishing our podcast then?
I think we're finishing.
Okay.
Matt, thank you so much for coming. It's always a joy.
Oh, my pleasure. Always a delight hanging out with both of you.
It's always a joy hanging out.
Yeah. Until next time.
Thank you, Rhonda. Bye, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, folks. Keep the questions and suggestions flowing. We love hearing from you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, the director of the Feeling Great Therapy Center. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.